Voters are sending a message that couldn't be louder, and it landed in Michigan on the same night. The president was busy trying to convince Las Vegas that his economy is the greatest in the history of the world. 90 days out from the midterms, the numbers don't lie, the polling doesn't lie, and the people standing in line at the grocery store definitely aren't lying when they say they can't make ends meet anymore. Let's start with what happened in Michigan, because it tells you almost everything you need to know about where this country's head is right now. Democratic voters turned out in numbers that stunned even seasoned political operatives. And when the votes were finally counted, progressive physician and former Detroit Health official Abdul Elsi had pulled off one of the closest and most consequential Senate primary victories of this entire cycle, edging out Congresswoman Haley Stevens by roughly a single percentage point after outside groups tied. The pro-Israel donors poured tens of millions of dollars into trying to stop him. Governor Gretchen Whitmer had thrown her weight behind Stevens in the campaign's final weeks, a last-minute move widely read as an attempt to head off a surging insurgent candidate. It didn't work. El-Sayed will now face Republican Mike Rogers in November, and if he wins, he will become the first Muslim ever elected to the United States Senate. Exit polling and voter interviews from that race point to the same conclusion again and again. Nearly a fifth of Democratic primary voters said the economy was the single biggest factor driving their vote, running neck and neck with sheer opposition to Donald Trump and the Republican Party. Those two things, the economy and Trump himself, have essentially fused together in the minds of voters. They are no longer separate stories. They are one story. And how did the president respond to a Democrat clawing out a win in a swing state he carried in 2024? He didn't pretend to be worried. He went on the attack, brushing off the result publicly and reaching for personal insults rather than engaging with what actually drove the outcome. That reaction tells you something important. Even when the results are inconvenient, even when they point directly at his own economic record, the instinct is never introspection. It's insult. It's deflection. It's retreating to grievance instead of confronting the substance of why voters are furious. Because make no mistake, they are furious. And the polling backs up in ways that are almost impossible to spin. A Fortune-reported survey from earlier this week put Trump's approval on the economy at just 32%, down from 40% when his second term began. During his entire first term in office, his lowest economic approval rating ever recorded was 40%. He is now running well below the floor he hit during his first 4 years, at a moment when Americans describe the national economy as poor by roughly a 7 in 10 margin. Other trackers paint an equally grim picture, with net approval on the economy sitting at some of the worst marks of his political career. Independent voters souring on him well past the threshold that historically precedes a wave election, and majority of the country now saying his policies have actively hurt the economy rather than helped it. Even people who voted for him are describing a squeeze so tight they say they practically need to take out a loan before they go grocery shopping. This is not a messaging problem. This is not spin from a hostile press. This is what people are telling pollsters, on the record, about their own kitchen tables. Meanwhile, the president himself is not exactly hiding his indifference. Even as prices climb and paychecks stretch thinner, he continues to insist publicly that this is a golden age for the American economy, that affordability concerns are manufactured, and that he deserves top marks for his stewardship. He took that message to Las Vegas this week, a city and a state that have felt the tariff regime and rising costs as sharply as anywhere in the country, campaigning on an economic record that a huge share of the country, including plenty of people who voted for him, simply does not recognize as reality. When voters were asked directly to grade his handling of the economy, the responses ranged from disappointed to outright scathing, with more than one person struggling to find anything positive to say after having been promised, repeatedly, that costs were going to come down. So how does a president square campaigning on affordability with insisting that affordability concerns are basically make-believe? According to people who cover him closely, including seasoned reporters who track how he spends his time, an enormous share of his daily focus these days isn't on the economy at all. It's reportedly centered on physical renovation project around the White House complex, on legacy building, on monuments to himself, while a much smaller share of his attention goes toward retribution against political rivals. Add those two preoccupations together, and there's precious little room left for the price of eggs, the price of gas, or the price of a doctor's visit. Voters may not all be policy wonks, But they don't need a degree in economics to notice when the person in charge seems more interested in a helipad than in their household budget. There's also a structural piece to this that helps explain why the disconnect keeps widening instead of narrowing. Reporting on his media habits suggests he consumes a narrow, heavily filtered diet coverage, largely favorable, largely insulated from dissenting voices, curated in a way that reinforces exactly what he already believes rather than challenging it. He travels far less than presidents typically do at this stage of term, skips the kind of rallies that used to give him a direct read on how his message was landing with actual voters, and increasingly operates inside a bubble that insulates him from the very anger-driving results like the one we just saw in Michigan. When the feedback loop only ever tells you that you're doing a great job, it becomes very easy to stand on a stage and call inflation a hoax while the people in the audience are doing mental math about whether they can afford dinner. Now, overlay another storyline onto all of this, because it's compounding the political damage in a way that's genuinely new. Corruption. Down in Texas, the Republican Senate nominee is Attorney General Ken Paxton, who won his party's nomination after a bitter 9-figure runoff against longtime incumbent John Cornyn, a race that only broke Paxton's way once the president threw his endorsement behind him. Paxton now heads into a general election against Democratic State Representative James Tallarico, carrying a well-documented list of baggage, including a securities fraud indictment that was eventually resolved, an impeachment trial in the state legislature that ended in acquittal, and a very public, very messy divorce filing from his wife. And in a twist that even some Republicans have found remarkable, Paxton has recently pivoted to campaigning on affordability himself, running ads suggesting the American dream is slipping out of reach and that health care costs are crushing families, a message that stands in direct contradiction to the president's own insistence that everything is going great. When a candidate from the president's own party starts running against the president's own economic talking points just to survive politically, that tells you something about how toxic that talking point has become at the doorstep. That corruption thread doesn't stop with one Senate race either. It's part of a broader pattern voters are picking up on, a sense that people at the very top are cashing in while everyone else falls further behind. Stories about a newly minted trillionaire with close ties to the White House, about lavish travel by well-connected officials while ordinary families cut back, about a political class that seems increasingly detached from the cost of living most Americans actually experience, all of it lands the same way, as confirmation that the people in charge simply do not share the same reality as the people they're supposed to represent. It's one thing to tell voters the economy is strong when it doesn't feel strong. It's another thing entirely to do that while photos circulate of private jets and multiple homes. That combination, economic pain paired with visible excess, is proving to be a genuinely combustible mix, and it's starting to erode support even among Trump's own base, the group that has stuck with him through scandal after scandal for the better part of a decade. And if the economic story wasn't damaging enough on its own, this week also brought a fresh, deeply uncomfortable moment in the Senate Judiciary Committee, where several of the president's judicial nominees were asked a question that should have a one-word answer: who won the 2020 presidential election, rather than simply saying Joe Biden won. Several nominees dodged, hedged, and retreated into technical language about certification processes and electromechanics, refusing to say the plain, well-established fact in front of senators and cameras. One nominee was pressed repeatedly and still wouldn't give a straightforward yes or no answer. Legal experts watching the exchange pointed out that this evasiveness extends beyond just the 2020 election, noting that some nominees have also declined to affirm that Brown v. Board of Education, the landmark 1954 ruling striking down school segregation, was correctly decided. That's not just political caution. That's nominees for lifetime seats on the federal bench signaling they're more comfortable performing loyalty to one man than affirming basic, settled facts about American law and history. It's a preview of the kind of judiciary being built for years to come, one where the fear of contradicting the president outweighs the obligation to simply tell the truth. Put all of these threads together, the record-low economic approval numbers, a president who seems more consumed by architecture and grievance than grocery prices, a Republican Senate nominee forced to run against his own party's economic message just to stay competitive, and judicial nominees too frightened to state basic facts. And you start to see why a race like Michigan's turned out the way it did. Voters aren't reacting to one bad headline. They're reacting to a pattern, A sustained sense that the promises made in the last campaign about lower prices and a stronger economy simply haven't materialized, and that the people in power either can't or won't admit it. That anger showed up in record primary turnout. It showed up in a razor-thin, history-making Senate nomination in Michigan. It's showing up in the approval numbers week after week. And with 90 days left before voters render their final verdict in November, there is no indication that the message from the West Wing is changing, even as the message from the American public keeps getting louder and harder to ignore. Whether that gap closes or whether it widens all the way to Election Day may end up being the defining story of this entire midterm cycle.